What must happen within a house for the new owners to avoid stepping inside for 67 years? It is not because they cannot, it is because they simply do not want to. In Los Angeles, exactly such a house stands upon a hill. Inside sit Christmas presents from 1959. Outside lies the usual Californian heat. Between them is only glass that no one has ever cleaned. Today, we explore 10 houses that were built as ultimate proofs of success, yet became something that no one dares to dismantle. We start with an island where the owner received the keys to 50 rooms and did not live to see the morning.
Number 10. We arrive at the Carlton Island Villa. It is a fortress to which no road leads. The blackened wooden and stone castle towers above the river like a sheer cliff, completely inaccessible without a specialized vessel. Thick fog regularly swallows this tiny piece of land, transforming the cold water into an absolute barrier. Such total detachment from the outside world was constructed as the ultimate measure of success, a personal bastion protected by geography itself. However, it is precisely this formidable water boundary that ultimately doomed the grand estate to a slow, inevitable decay, rendering any rescue of the building logistically impossible. Today, heavy river dampness settles within the collapsed grand halls, while an entire kilometer of dark, deep water lies silently between the ruined mansion and the nearest shore. Today, the structure is merely a rotting wooden skeleton, but initially, this ambitious project was conceived as an absolute sanctuary. Arms magnate William Wyckoff was not simply building a standard summer cottage, he was carefully erecting an impregnable bastion of the American dream for his wife. Tons of carved stone and precious types of wood were laboriously transported across the water in order to create a perfect paradise atop the island cliff. This grand mansion was intended to become a lasting symbol of eternal family triumph, completely shielded from prying eyes by an insurmountable river barrier. However, the grandiose isolation designed to protect their peace ultimately transformed the estate into a luxurious prison, where the immense thickness of the walls proved entirely useless against the inherent fragility of the human body.
According to New York obituaries from 1895, this grand monument to success became a crypt even before the varnish had fully dried in its expansive halls. William Wyckoff's wife passed away from cancer just 1 month before the completion of construction. The grieving magnate climbed from the river shore to the steep cliff entirely alone, intending to spend his first night within the echoing corridors of the newly built castle. This moment was not a long-awaited architectural victory, but merely a final act demonstrating the absolute powerlessness of vast wealth against human biology. That very same night, Wyckoff's heart stopped. In the morning, the servants discovered their master's lifeless body, while the untouched keys to 50 empty rooms lay silently on the nearby table. Today, the wind sweeps freely through the collapsed floors of the towers, although these very walls were originally constructed as an eternal citadel of the American dream. Terrified by the double death, the heirs flatly refused to ever cross the threshold. They abandoned the grand villa to rot above the steep stone cliff, transforming a symbol of luxury into an inaccessible mausoleum to which not a single road has led for an entire century. This voluntary isolation becomes the first symptom on our list. Vast capital is simply incapable of stopping the process of decay. Instead of the expected warmth of family chambers, only a drafty void remains here, where rusty nails and fragments of slate roofing slowly crumble down onto the untouched oak parquet. Number 9. The Wyckoff Mansion in New York State stands as a monument to another person's ego, a towering structure that was supposed to last forever. The immense brick towers, with their tall, lancet windows, resembling a gloomy Gothic castle, are slowly being consumed by the surrounding forest. Thick roots pierce the grand ceremonial masonry, and wild vines weave a dense shroud over the completely collapsed roof. This imposing architecture was originally created as an impenetrable fortress of American success, specifically designed to keep wealthy dynasties securely inside. However, the younger generations eventually departed for the major cities, leaving the empty halls to rot away under the relentless onslaught of the encroaching soil. Now, there is neither grandeur nor a future remaining here, only damp brick, silently settling into the deep mud. In 1853, this very mansion became the epicenter of an architectural hysteria. Elizabeth Jones constructed a sprawling labyrinth of 24 rooms, complete with intricate stained glass and carved oak. This provoked such a relentless status race among her neighbors that it ultimately gave birth to the famous phrase, "keeping up with the Joneses." But the ambitious attempt to wall up personal success in solid stone proved to be a trap, exposing the inherent vulnerability of these grand ceremonial fortresses. The immense halls demanded large dynasties to sustain them. However, the demographics were inexorably changing. The younger generations were steadily leaving for the major cities, while maintenance expenses continued to rise. Today, of that eternal triumph, only sagging oak beams and empty doorways remain, where the wind freely sweeps in dry forest soil. According to the official court archives of those years, the relentless race for social status ultimately proved to be a tightening financial noose for the remaining heirs. The tragic demise of Wycliffe was not caused by a sudden cataclysm, but rather by a slow and agonizing suffocation brought on by mounting unpaid bills. The daily maintenance of such an enormous estate required substantial capital, funds that rapidly melted away just as the family itself steadily shrank. This particular collapse clearly exposes a recurring mechanism that we will encounter again at the very top of our list. The seemingly impregnable fortress of personal success inevitably crumbles under the heavy combined pressure of unchecked ambition and a shifting economy. The overwhelmed owners quietly went bankrupt and forever departed from the emptying halls. Today, thick tree roots pierce the crumbling brickwork, and the south wing, stripped of its original oak supports, slowly settles deep into the damp forest soil. Beneath a thick layer of rotting leaves and a dense tangle of wild vines, a shapeless mound can be clearly discerned. This is no natural terrain. This is exactly where the main tower of Wycliffe collapsed. As the lineage of the owners steadily dwindled and the few remaining heirs abandoned the valley, the massive house lost its ability to resist the harsh elements. What was originally erected as an impregnable fortress and an uncompromising monument to personal success could not withstand the simple reality of demographic emptiness. The architectural ego, once proudly cast in terracotta and heavy stone, ultimately proved to be remarkably fragile. Today, all that remains of this symbol of absolute superiority is a mere pile of broken brick, which the forest soil relentlessly reclaims, centimeter by centimeter. Number 8. The dome houses of Cape Romano. This is a striking example of utopian architecture that ultimately lost its fierce battle with the surrounding geography. Now, these 6 white concrete hemispheres, elevated on massive pilings, protrude directly from the murky ocean waves. Relentless currents constantly crash against their remarkably smooth walls, creating a surreal landscape that resembles not a traditional Florida mansion, but rather a flooded alien colony. Originally, these unique modules were constructed as completely autonomous fortresses of the American dream, expressly designed to eternally dominate the natural elements. Instead, they have gradually transformed into a rotting monument to human ego, hopelessly stranded upon an unforgiving climatic frontier. Today, the waterline rests exactly where hardwood floors once lay, while the immense salty pressure of the ocean methodically undermines the remaining load-bearing supports. Where Dark Water stands today, a wide strip of dry sand originally lay. On the very edge of the pristine white shore, a reclusive millionaire constructed the perfect autonomous sanctuary. This was not simply an isolated summer residence. It was an attempt to cast the American dream in a thick layer of solid concrete. 6 smooth domes were conceived as an impenetrable fortress, featuring hidden reservoirs for fresh water and complete energy independence. The owner genuinely believed that these massive structures could eternally dominate the surrounding landscape. However, the ambitious project did not account for the complex dynamics of the barrier island. The climatic threshold shifted, and the ocean began to methodically wash away the land from beneath the heavy pilings. According to Florida coastal monitoring data from the early 1990s, the shoreline was retreating by several meters every single year. However, the final blow was dealt not by slow, gradual erosion, but by a series of fierce hurricanes that radically reshaped the entire geography of the barrier island. The impenetrable fortress, designed for eternal triumph, successfully withstood the violent wind, but the solid land beneath it simply ceased to exist. The heavy concrete pillars, once firmly buried in dry sand, were plunged into an aggressive saline environment. Soon, the cold pressure of the Gulf concealed the original foundation, forever cutting the buildings off from the mainland with a strip of murky silt. Above the crashing surf line, situated far from the nearest sandy beach, smooth concrete hemispheres now rise directly from the dark water. The unusual architecture fulfilled its original purpose with a truly frightening precision. The heavy domes proved to be far too sturdy to ever collapse. This striking monument to private ambitions did not simply disappear, but instead found itself trapped in absolute maritime captivity. Relentless waves continuously crash against the bare walls of former living rooms, while the rising waterline slowly creeps toward the shattered glass of the windows. Such profound isolation sets a clear scale for all the subsequent stories on our documentary route. The powerful ocean did not need to break this fortress of the American dream. It simply swallowed the land beneath it. The elite refuge transformed into an empty shell, permanently sealed away in the open sea. Number 7. Madam Sherry Castle, New Hampshire, a monument to egoism, completely erased by an extreme temperature threshold. Amidst the dense, silent forest, a striking anomaly rises from the ground. This is not a shapeless foundation, but rather a grandiose stone staircase featuring elegant Roman arches standing absolutely intact. It gracefully curves upward, inviting visitors into a residence that simply no longer exists. The original mansion was built as an impregnable fortress of personal success, yet today, only charred boulders and dark soil, retaining the traces of old ash, lie scattered around the surrounding area. The perfectly preserved steps abruptly break off at the exact height of the former second floor. The final stone flight now leads directly into the... During the Jazz Age, these blackened ruins were certainly not a dead forest. A former Parisian dancer completely transformed them into the epicenter of the most extravagant bohemian parties. The castle was deliberately constructed, not as a classic refuge, but rather as an isolated empire meant for the grand demonstration of personal triumph. Here, amidst the remote wilderness, fine crystal clinked and an orchestra played. Today, this incredibly sharp transition from absolute luxury to charred emptiness provokes a strange sense of numbness. In the exact spots where massive oak tables once stood, only soot-covered pieces of the foundation now protrude from the baked earth. Extreme thermal deformation has permanently fused the remains of wrought iron candelabras directly. When the bank accounts finally emptied, this forest fortress of egoism transformed into an isolated prison for the fading mind of its owner. Here is what usually remains behind the scenes. The palace was destroyed not by time, but by a mundane intrusion. According to local fire reports from the early 60s, looters started a blaze that consumed the wooden floors overnight and turned the interiors into carbonized ash. The flames destroyed absolutely everything except the stone, starkly exposing the fragility of such monuments to personal success. Now only a soot-blackened grand staircase stands here, blindly breaking off into the void at the height of the second floor.
A stone arcade hovers among the canopy of the trees. This massive staircase with carved railings rises directly into the forest void, as if the building itself simply dissolved into thin air. Instead of an impregnable fortress of the American dream, there remains a surreal monument to egoism, where a pompous entrance leads to charred branches. This surviving facade, completely devoid of any internal structure, anticipates that frightening illusion of control which we will discover at the top of our route. The scorched stones preserve an eerie calmness. On the upper landing, where the masonry abruptly breaks off, only rainwater and dark soot ingrained in the granite now accumulate. Number 6. Halcyon Hall, a facade that should have disappeared a long time ago. The gigantic wooden building with 200 rooms greets visitors with a yawning emptiness where the roof of the colossal structure has collapsed deep inside. This is not just an architectural death. It is a visible collapse of the illusion of eternal success, where the peeling paint and blackened towers resemble the ominous hotel from The Shining. Administrative emptiness arrived at this location long before physical decay began. When the financial accounts emptied and the status of an elite institution was struck from the official registries, the castle was simply abandoned to the elements. Now only tons of damp boards and the remains of door frames crushed by the fallen ceilings lie scattered across the grand hall. Decades ago, these halls knew absolutely no decay. They functioned as a closed incubator for the daughters of the most influential families in America. This establishment was not merely a traditional school, but a strictly guarded social fortress specifically designed to cement the status of the elite. Strict daily regulations dictated every single step, effectively transforming the luxurious mansion into a comfortable yet entirely isolated reservation. However, when the underlying financial logic ultimately failed, the administrative machine dispassionately shut down the entire project. The foundational charter was revoked. The educational license was officially annulled. Now, the only remaining reminder of that former discipline is a faded lecture schedule, firmly pinned to a wall covered with peeling paint. The rows of oak desks are still aligned perfectly straight. The illusion of eternal stability collapsed not from the passage of time, but due to a shift in social paradigms. According to judicial archives from the late 70s, the massive transition of universities to co-education instantly deprived this female fortress of new students. The very isolation that made the mansion a symbol of elite success ultimately became its doom. The rigid business model could not withstand the changing cultural climate, bankrupting the institution in a single season. This was not a slow fading of old traditions. It was a dry, calculated liquidation. The final entry in the accounting ledger abruptly ends in November, after which the accounts were completely frozen, leaving abandoned lecture notes to gather dust in locked classrooms. Open dictionaries still lie upon the tables of the dead library, as if the female students had merely stepped out for a single minute. The lecture schedule, hanging against a background of peeling paint, now looks like a deeply contradictory sign. This is not the romance of decay. It is a dry, administrative amputation. Hundreds of rotting textbooks and personal belongings were abandoned in the sudden panic of bankruptcy, when this fortress of elite success transformed into a financial trap, exposing the mechanism of collapse that we will examine next. The damp paper has fused together into heavy, inseparable blocks. The liquidator's seals on the heavy oak doors routinely completed the process, securely locking inside the inventory book collection and the winter coats left forgotten in the wardrobe. Number 5. Dungeness Mansion. This grand fortress of the American dream was originally constructed as a monument to eternal success, but now its charred brick walls continue to crumble with every powerful squall blowing in from the ocean. There is no familiar museum silence to be experienced here, only the sharp crunch of sagging structural floors, constantly threatening to collapse onto any careless guest who wanders inside. Through the wide gaps of the former grand reception halls, where thick roots slowly break open the remaining marble, entire herds of wild horses roam freely today. This is not merely a frozen historical decoration, but rather a zone of relentless, active decay. The heavy hooves of the animals methodically crush the exposed remains of the stone foundation, trampling the final symbol of an outsider's monumental ego deep into the greedy, all-consuming soil.
This immense structure was erected not merely as a place for leisurely recreation, but rather as an instrument of absolute control over the entire island. The Carnegie family aggressively bought up vast territories, strictly forbidding local residents from hunting anywhere within these expansive forests. Total isolation. The Grand Palace, featuring 59 rooms, served as an impregnable citadel, specifically designed to completely fence off its wealthy owners from the outside world. However, it is precisely this rigid architecture of exclusivity that ultimately formed the current structural trap. In the exact places where guards once patrolled the grounds, creeping vines now methodically tear apart the crumbling brickwork. The heavy ceremonial arches, which once protected the elite, today are held up only by severely rusted beams, threatening to collapse entirely at the slightest shift of the unstable soil. According to surviving reports about the 1959 fire, the illusion of impregnability collapsed in a single night. Local poachers, seeking revenge for the loss of access to the hunting grounds, set the Carnegie Mansion ablaze simultaneously from all sides. This fortress of the American dream was ultimately destroyed by its very own exclusivity. Its extreme isolation from the mainland left absolutely no chance to save the grand building. The intense flames completely gutted the luxurious interiors, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell, which is now being greedily consumed by thick tree roots and creeping wild vines. Today, this rotting monument to immense egoism poses a direct physical threat. Severely weakened by the extreme temperatures of the blaze and decades of relentless erosion, massive stone chimneys weighing tens of tons continue to suddenly collapse into the unstable soil. Among the crumbling marble columns, where the destinies of industrial America were once decided, now only the hollow thud of hooves echoes. Wild horses wander into the former ballrooms, seeking shelter from the scorching sun. A thick canopy of wild vines greedily consumes the space, transforming this symbol of impregnable success into an eerie, unstable greenhouse. This scene reveals what we will come to understand later on. Nature does not simply reclaim its territory. It completely erases the very illusion of human control. The massive brick arches looming over the animals, thoroughly eaten away by roots and the salty wind, are held together exclusively by internal friction, ready to abruptly collapse at the slightest shift in the soil. Number 4. Dundas Castle, New York, an illusion of a European fairy tale hidden deep within a dense, isolated forest. The massive gray stone walls form a sheer facade, rising impregnably above the thick canopy of surrounding trees. This grand palace was originally constructed to represent the absolute triumph of the American dream, yet its architectural layout reveals a very different, much darker purpose. The profound silence enveloping the building feels entirely unnatural, perfectly preserving the frightening mystery of this forgotten place. If one raises their gaze toward the unreachable upper tiers, the grand illusion of luxury completely shatters. Within the arched openings of the highest floors, situated tens of meters above the ground, thick metal bars are permanently embedded directly into the solid stone. The original intention was entirely different. Ralph Dundas constructed this fortress as the greatest gift for his wife Josephine, attempting to cast the American dream in the form of an eternal monument. Inside, traces of an interrupted triumph still remain. Wooden crates filled with Italian tile and carved marble fireplaces installed directly onto rough subfloors. Tons of finishing materials were painstakingly hauled up the steep slope to create an isolated paradise at this impressive elevation. However, instead of standing as a symbol of success, the grand mansion froze in a strange state of suspended animation.
On the upper tiers, rolls of architectural blueprints continue to rest on bare concrete beside untouched stacks of drying oak parquet flooring.
In 1921, Ralph Dundas suddenly passed away, leaving the project completely unfinished. As the court archives of that time testify, this sudden loss served as a catalyst. Josephine's sanity could not withstand the tragedy. The grand fortress, constructed as a symbol of the American dream, became not a sanctuary, but the perfect isolation chamber. Appointed guardians locked the widow inside a room on the very highest tier, completely cutting her off from the outside world by a steep, almost vertical staircase. For years, she existed solely among bare brick walls and settling construction dust. The heavy metal bars on the windows of this single bedroom are still permanently embedded into the gray stone of the facade. Far below, directly beneath the tightly locked tower, stretches an extensive suite of grand ceremonial halls where not a single fireplace was ever lit. These vast spaces were constructed not as a cozy residence, but rather as a monumental tribute to eternal success and prosperity. Yet, in the end, they never welcomed even a single guest. The magnificent marble portals and the completely untouched oak staircases transformed into a silent, chilling architectural vacuum. The isolated sound of a nurse's footsteps fell through the dark stairwells and down into the echoing emptiness of the massive living rooms below, perfectly emphasizing the true scale of this profound vertical isolation. The enormous palace never once functioned according to its original intended purpose. Instead, it de facto remained nothing more than an incredibly complex, inescapable stone cage, built solely for one tragic and slowly fading human mind. Number 3. Linwood Hall, located in Pennsylvania. A palace that was originally supposed to completely outlive the very concept of the American dream. Today, instead of eternal triumph, behind a heavily rusted perimeter fence hide 110 silent rooms of steadily crumbling architectural luxury. Tarnished layers of gold leaf continuously fall onto the cracked surface of imported marble, and damp moisture slowly settles deep within empty ballrooms that are roughly the size of an indoor stadium. This vast estate is not merely a frozen museum suspended in time. It is a slowly rotting monument to profound human egoism, where the sheer scale of the initial concept only emphasizes the devastating depth of its historical loss. In the grand ceremonial galleries, specifically designed to display a private collection of Rembrandt, nothing accumulates now except shattered glass and heavy plaster. At the peak of the Gilded Age, transportation magnate Peter Widener did not merely build a cozy family nest, he constructed a monumental architectural Olympus. One of the most grandiose private homes in the entire country was conceived as an impregnable fortress intended to ensure the eternal prosperity of his dynasty. During that prosperous era, a vast army of servants moved silently along corridors of imported limestone, while immense financial fortunes were merged within secluded, walnut-paneled studies. Yet the living warmth of the inhabitants was initially lost within the cold scale of these grand halls, which were designed primarily as a showcase of boundless wealth. Ultimately, this magnificent triumph proved to be incredibly fragile. The family abandoned the sprawling estate forever, leaving behind nothing but empty. Death silently penetrated this fortress on a simple sheet of paper. According to the archival records from 1912, the collapse of the dynasty began not with a stock market crash, but with a devastatingly brief telegram. The Titanic investor, Peter Widener, tragically lost his son and his grandson during the maiden voyage of the doomed ocean liner. The massive stone facades, erected as an impregnable bastion of the American dream, proved entirely powerless against the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The sprawling mansion quickly transformed into a luxurious tomb for the grieving survivors, directly anticipating the absolute emptiness that we will soon encounter in the grand finale. The magnate slowly faded away from immense grief. Exactly 3 years later,
his pulse finally stopped within one of the 110 increasingly deserted rooms.
The peeling gold leaf on the stucco of the grand halls now outlines a space that proved entirely too heavy for the living. The heirs received not a symbol of eternal success, but a massive emotional crypt, where each of the 110 rooms pressed down with the memory of freezing water. This was not a financial collapse. It was a quiet evacuation in the face of the immense scale of the loss. The thinning family line simply could not exist within this palace-turned-mausoleum. The bronze handles of the main doors turned for the final time, locking hectares of imported marble and tarnished mirrors, alone with the settling dust. Number 2. The Oliver family mansion, a grand fortress that has been officially erased from all cadastral registries. On the outside, the facade is entirely consumed by dense thickets, effectively concealing a former architectural triumph. However, behind the heavy doors, a profound emptiness finally takes shape. These are not typical decaying ruins, but rather a frozen inventory of someone else's egoism. Inside the wardrobes hang long rows of expensive clothing, now covered in a thick gray layer of dust. On the solid oak tables lie stacks of unopened letters with completely untouched postage stamps, whose intended addressees seem annulled by a single administrative act. The settling dust methodically preserves this forgotten luxury, transforming a former symbol of eternal success into a hermetic archive, where every single item remains fixed exactly at the moment the postal code was revoked.
Inside remained a fortune exceeding the budgets of small municipalities. Oil paintings, antique furniture sets, and porcelain worth millions of dollars did not merely fill the halls, they served as material evidence of the dynasty's immortality. However, when the status of the estate was legally annulled, all this wealth found itself locked within a legal vacuum. This is not a preserved museum exhibition, but rather a blind spot of the system. The property was not confiscated, it simply ceased to be listed in official documents, transforming the fortress of success into a hermetic prison for luxury. In the dark living rooms, bronze clocks ticked away the time for masterpieces, whose market value plummeted to zero the exact moment the coordinates of the house were deleted.
A dozen ambitious heirs ultimately tore the empire apart from the inside. According to official district court records, years of relentless cross-lawsuits over valuable antiques and contested trust shares created a dense administrative deadlock. The profound human egoism that originally erected this monument to the American dream paradoxically became the primary mechanism of its isolation. It was not heavy steel padlocks that secured the carved oak doors, but rather strict official injunctions. The presiding court legally prohibited any physical intervention in the fate of the property. While the lawyers endlessly exchanged legal petitions in courtrooms, devastating dampness accumulated freely within the structural ceilings. This absolute legal paralysis proved far stronger than solid brickwork, perfectly anticipating that ruthless force of bureaucratic erasure, which we will.
The legal injunction stopped time, and relentless moisture completed the destructive process. Inside the sealed rooms, the valuable antiques that tore the family apart found themselves trapped in a profound administrative snare. This is not a careful preservation of heritage, it is a methodical physical erasure. Unchecked dampness freely saturated the silk carpets and severely warped the inlaid mahogany facades, while the heirs waited for years for the court seizure to be officially lifted. The vast fortune, which once served as a symbol of absolute success, simply rotted in place, ultimately going to none of the plaintiffs. The property registry officially lost its meaning the exact moment the immense wealth described in the legal papers finally settled onto the parquet floor as waterlogged debris.
Number 1. The Los Feliz Mansion, a facade of the American dream, permanently frozen in perfect isolation. From the outside, it appears to be simply a neat house situated on a quiet Californian hill, whose perimeter is slowly being consumed by harsh, encroaching roots. However, peering through the cloudy glass reveals something entirely unexpected. It is not the usual state of ruin, but rather a profoundly paralyzing state of preservation. Inside the property, everything has remained in the exact position it was left in 1959. This imposing fortress of private success has paradoxically turned into a hermetic display case. On the coffee table, unopened Christmas presents still lie undisturbed, and the screen of an old television is completely covered with a thick layer of untouched gray dust.
This house was built as a monument to absolute prosperity. Dr. Harold Perelson brought his family into this geometry of success, filling the spacious rooms with heavy textiles and polished wood. The mansion was conceived as an impregnable fortress of the American dream, a material embodiment of status, where every single object was meticulously arranged to demonstrate wealth. At the top of a prestigious hill, they found themselves in complete isolation from the urban chaos of the city below. However, this architectural hermeticism, which was originally intended to protect their peace and flatter the ego of the owner, functioned in an entirely different manner. The massive front doors and thick structural barriers simply severed the internal space from the reality of the outside world, permanently trapped.
As documented in the official investigation materials of 1959, the sudden collapse of this fortress occurred entirely from within. Without any visible reason, Dr. Perelson murdered his sleeping wife, attacked his eldest daughter with a hammer, and consumed a lethal dose of acid. This was not a criminal invasion. The impenetrable facade of the American dream simply swallowed its inhabitants, transforming the mansion into a luxurious trap. Since that dark December night, the interior space has been completely frozen in an abrupt silence. Everyday belongings remain exactly as they were hastily abandoned. Unpacked Christmas presents resting beneath a shedding tree, open magazines, and a vintage tube television, whose glass screen is covered with an even layer of dry dust.
Out of everything we have explored on this list, I find this particular conclusion the most difficult to fully comprehend. The holiday gifts, wrapped in faded foil, simply remained lying undisturbed upon the carpet. The new owners, who purchased the house along with all of its original belongings, never once crossed its threshold, leaving the entire building in a state of indefinite quarantine. This is not an official police seal. It is a completely voluntary abandonment of life inside a flawless facade. For decades, the dried pine needles have silently fallen onto the untouched boxes. Instead of demonstrating wealth and status, this fortress transformed into a sealed vault, securely locking away a stranger's holiday that never actually arrived.
And this tragedy, frozen in time, where an ideal world collapsed under the weight of internal madness, perfectly summarizes our entire journey today. All of these luxurious walls prove one undeniable truth. No matter how strongly you build your castle, you cannot protect it from time, nature, and your own demons. Which of the reasons for abandonment presented here seem the most frightening to you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.